public speaker and author who holds a dual appointment in the Psychology Department and the Center for Cognitive Science at Rutgers University. He's the author of numerous scientific articles. His research has been published in top scientific journals and funded by the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation. Julien has appeared on national television. His writings have been discussed in popular magazines, and he has been a guest on radio, podcast programs in the United States and abroad. Please welcome Julien.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Can you all hear me well? Wonderful. Good morning to all of you. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here this morning with you. Thank you for the invitation. I very much look forward at the end of the remarks I'm going to make to also get a chance to interact with you on a more intimate, personal basis. I hear we'll have a chance to do that upstairs with coffee and food. I must confess at the outset that what I'm about to do is a bit unusual for me. I usually give scientific presentations, lectures, public lectures with PowerPoint slides and all kinds of animations and everything. But today I'm going to take off my hat as a lecturer, take off my hat as a scientist, and tell you something a bit more personal that relates to this question that I've been thinking about for a long time now, the question of the human soul. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my journey trying to understand this question, trying to understand who we are. That's going to take us back to a time when I was a young teenager, through a time of loss when I was in my mid-20s, and to the present day where I think I've finally come to peace with this question and come to a conclusion that I would like to share with you. So the story begins in around 1986 in the southwest of France, in Bordeaux. You've all heard of Bordeaux, it's famous for its wine. I grew up in France. As a young teenager, I was fascinated with the English language. I wanted to learn the English language, I wanted to live abroad, I wanted to travel. I wanted to travel to the UK, I wanted to travel to the United States, and I would do anything to learn that language. So one day I went to a bookstore in Bordeaux and picked up perhaps the only book that they had there that was in English. The book was called The Seed of Evil. It was a science fiction book, a collection of short stories by an author called Barrington Bailey. My English was not very good at the time. I'd taken English at school, so I could understand some of it, but it was not very, very good. So I picked up the book and eagerly tried to read it. The first story in that book was called The God Gun. So I began to read it, and the story was, what I understood of the story was fascinating. It's a story that took place at the end of the 20th century when two, of course it's science fiction, it's not real, but you'll see how amazing it is and how it launched me on a decade-long search for the soul. So in that story, the two main protagonists, Roderick and his friend, Harry. Harry was a very creative, sort of mad scientist who had decided one day that he wanted to kill God. He wanted to kill God because he was unhappy about certain aspects of his life. He didn't think that the universe needed God to run anyway. And he thought he had found a way to get to God. And he explained to his friend Roderick how he was going to do it. So he had built in his home lab a very elaborate contraption of lasers and mirrors and prism. And the idea was to build a system of light that would reinforce itself infinitely, transcending space and time and hitting God with a deadly bolt of energy, therefore killing God. That was his idea. And he invited his friend Roderick one night to do just that. So they put on their dark goggles, and Harry was about to turn on the switch, which he did. The lights went on, the light grew brighter and brighter, and at some point it engulfed the entire room. And one moment later, the light was gone. And Harry then lifted his goggles and said, my apology. Rule number 1, turn off your cell phone, especially when you're the speaker. So he lifts up his goggles, looks and says very calmly, "That's it, God is dead." His friend lifts up his goggles, looks around, and notices that nothing has changed. And he says, "Preposterous." And then he looked into his friend's eyes and saw that they were all dead inside. That in fact Harry had killed God, and that in the process he had killed the soul. Everything continued to move on according to mechanical laws. The universe went on, people's lives went on, but all the beauty, all the inner essence, all the meaning was gone. And that's what Harry reflected. That's what God provided after all. He provided the soul. He provided this meaning, this beauty, those internal feelings. That story, at least as much as I could understand it at the time, really haunted me. I was fascinated by that. And I wondered, I was 16, what... another cell phone. Not the speaker, so it's fine. And I really wondered... are we good? Yes? And I really wondered how anyone could ever find out whether there is such a thing as a soul. So I started thinking and reading. And then I came across a wonderful thinker I'm sure you've all heard about, Bertrand Russell. I want to read you a quote by him that started me at the outset of this investigation. And then I'll read you a quote by him at the end as the journey closes. So the quote comes from an interview that he was given on these questions for the BBC before he died, probably in the 1950s. He was asked, well, how do we decide whether things are true or not true? And here's what he said. He said, either the thing is true or it isn't. If it is true, you should believe it. And if it isn't, you shouldn't. It was really about what we should believe. And then he added, and if you can't find out whether it is true or it isn't, you should suspend judgment. And so for a while I suspended judgment as a teenager. I didn't really know whether we had souls or not. And I didn't really seem to think of a way to find out. So I suspended judgment, following Russell's motto. About 10 years later, I had moved to America. I immigrated from France. I was now in graduate school at the University of Maryland, working on my PhD. And on May 17th, 1998, at 4:30 in the afternoon, I received a phone call from my mother in France, telling me that my younger brother, Valerie, who was 25, had died. I was crushed. I couldn't sleep that night. I was devastated. He was young, he had his whole life ahead of him, and he died in a terrible accident. What made things even worse for me is that I could not go back to France to be there for my family, to attend his funeral, because, this might make you smile or even laugh, it's a supreme irony, but I was wanted by the French military. I had moved to the US and had spent a bit of time in the military, but they wanted me back. There was military service at the time was something that young Frenchmen had, it's changed since then, but had to do. And so the French wanted me back, and I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to interrupt my studies. And so I couldn't go back. And so I lived this tragedy from afar. And I remember I spoke to my parents on the phone every day. We shared our pain and tried to comfort each other. And I remember that the question of the soul came up again. My mother in particular asked me, because she said, well, you're studying, you're getting your doctorate, maybe you know, do you think that Valerie's in a better place? Do you think that he still lives on somehow? Do you think that he watches us? And again, I didn't really know. I said, I'm not sure. I'll be honest with you, Mom, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether he is or not. And my mom was on the fence also. She didn't really know whether she believed that he was in a better place or whether he was simply no more and only existed in our memories. This was a really rough period. But life went on. We're resilient creatures after all. And then, years later, I started my career as a researcher, and I came back to these questions because I realized that what I did for a living, studying human behavior, studying the human mind, studying the cognitive sciences, actually had implications for the question of the soul. I realized in thinking more about it that the kind of soul that most people believe in, the kind of immortal, immaterial soul that people believe in, the soul that carries your consciousness into the afterlife, the soul that my mother wondered whether Valor was still alive, whether he was there as a soul. I realized that this is in fact a scientific question, and that it can be addressed as such. And so I started to think about it. And eventually, in 2015, only a couple of years ago, I wrote my first popular science book called The Soul Fallacy. Now I thought that I had reached an answer, not just for myself, but I thought I had reached the truth. I wanted to know, I deeply wanted to know, from the time I was a teenager through the loss of my brother, I wanted to know what was true and not true. I wanted to be able to anchor my feelings, my emotions, to something that was true. I didn't want to believe just for the sake of believing. I wanted to try to believe in something that was true, that science could tell us was likely to be true or not. So I wrote this book, and it was published. And in the book, I argued that we do not have souls. And I'm not going to give you all the details and all the arguments today. I'm assuming that you probably have reached, many of you, the same conclusion. Although I'd be more than happy to talk to you about this, to talk to you about the ideas when we meet up for coffee later. But that gave me, having reached the conclusion that we're very unlikely to have souls, I then thought again about my brother, and it brought me enormous comfort to know that he wasn't suffering anymore, that he did not exist anymore, that he only existed in our memories. That really, really made me feel better. Incidentally, when I went back to France for the first time, after he had died, after I sorted out my situation with the military, I went to the cemetery where he was buried. And seeing his name on the tombstone, I fell apart. It was too much. I couldn't. And I still thought at the time that maybe he was around. And the pain of knowing that he was around somehow, if he actually was, but I couldn't talk to him, I could not connect with him, was almost unbearable. This pain is gone now because of the conclusions that I have reached. And I've tried to share these conclusions with other people in writing this book. Like I said, that came out a couple of years ago. And since then, I've been giving a lot of public speeches, public lectures on this very question. It's very touchy. It's not controversial scientifically because modern science has pretty much abandoned the traditional soul, but it's very touchy among the general public. And I really enjoy talking about these questions because they're questions that bear on what makes us human, on science, on truth. They're fascinating, and I hope to get a chance to talk to you about them a bit later after the program is over. So I wanted to end, and I don't know how much time I have. I don't want to take too much time. I'm happy to talk as much as you would like, but I was told to keep this brief. We could even I'd be very happy to have a Q&A session here where I'm at the microphone, if that's okay, because I hear that you're a very talkative crowd with lots of thoughts and ideas, and I tend to speak for a living, so I'm very happy to also listen to other people talk, and I'm very happy to have you make comments or ask me questions about anything I've said. But I wanted to end with another quote by Bertrand Russell, a motto that I try to live by now, having reached the conclusions that I have reached. A motto that is hard to live by, but a motto that I aspire to live by. And here's the quote. It was given to him during the same interview that he gave for the BBC many decades ago. And he was asked again about the questions of science and religion, questions of truth and falsehood. He was asked about what we should and shouldn't believe and under what conditions. And at the end he said the following. He was asked by the journalist, well, don't you think it's good for people sometimes to hold certain beliefs, even if they're not true, but maybe it brings them comfort? So here's what Russell said. He said, it seems to me fundamental dishonesty and fundamental treachery to intellectual integrity to hold a belief because you think it's useful and not because you think it's true. And that really, as a human being and as a scientist, touches me very deeply. It's a beautiful quote. It's also a very hard standard to live by. I would never want to take away from someone that belief if it does bring them comfort. The great intellectual Noam Chomsky, who you may have heard about, was once asked about those questions. What should we do as intellectuals, as academics, when, for example, people believe in certain things that science teaches us are not worthy of belief or irrational? And he said, well, it depends. If, for example, half the country believes that the Earth is 6,000 years old, then we should try to correct that. That's what we do in high schools, in universities. He said, but if a poor woman from someplace in Latin America who's just lost her son happens to believe that his soul still lives on, he said, I would not have the audacity to give her a lesson in epistemology. And I think that's a wonderful approach as well. So the conclusions I have reached, I've presented in a public forum, but the idea is not to force people to think the way we scientists think, but to simply show them that these are conclusions that we can reach on the basis of reason, and that they're welcome to think about them themselves. It's a different perspective from the traditional one that most people, especially in our country, have heard over and over again. And it's an encouragement for people to use their own capacity for reason, capacity for critical thinking, to reach whatever conclusions they can reach, and to hope, as it has been the case for me, that reaching certain conclusions, hopefully true ones, will lead them to end up in a better place and to be better able to deal with tragedy and sorrow to the extent that this happens in people's lives as well. So, on these words, I'm going to now end these remarks. Thank you very much for your attention. See, I kept it short. And very much encourage a dialogue. I mean, I'd much rather chat with you than stand here and give you details about why, although you can ask, why I've reached the conclusion that we don't have souls. This would take a long time, but again, I'm happy to talk about this. So thank you very much. Now the fun part begins. Yes.
From what you briefly said, I wrote down what I think you mean by the soul. And what I wrote down was, and I quoted, the soul that consciousness exists after death. Would that be your definition of soul?
That's a very good question. So I'll give you. Is it still working? Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I'll give you a definition that I reached based on. It's a descriptive definition. It's based on not what I believe, but what most people believe. How do you find out what most people believe? You ask them. That's very simple. So I did a few years ago. I gave students in my classes at Rutgers a series of questionnaires, in which I asked them the following question: do you believe that you have a soul? First question. Pick a value on the scale from 1 to 6. 1 is definitely not. 6 is absolutely yes, with values in between. And I've done this many times with different groups of students. These were educated people who were taking classes in cognitive science and neuroscience. Much to my surprise, about 80% of students at Rutgers picked a value on the scale from between 4 and 6. That is to say, probably yes, all the way to definitely yes. So most students believe that we have a soul. Then I asked them, to follow up on what you said, well, what do you think your soul is? Because of course the soul can mean so many different things. So I gave them different choices. The first choice was the soul is an immaterial entity that is separate from the body. The second was the soul is a metaphor. It's a way to talk about your body and your emotions and your feelings and your personality, but it's just a metaphor. You are a purely physical being. The third was it's an old idea that's now obsolete and doesn't really contribute to our understanding. Again, much to my surprise, I found that an overwhelming majority of students picked the first option. They thought that the soul, their soul, was an immaterial entity separate from the body. Then I asked them, in a number of follow-up questions, what does the soul do for you? What does it give you? And then I gave them a number of options. And amazingly, they told me that the soul gives them a moral compass, consciousness, free will, their feelings, their ability to make decisions, and so on and so forth. So for these people, the soul is psychologically potent. It contributes to their psychological function. And then, of course, finally, they told me that their soul was immortal. In other words, that once their body ceases to function, their consciousness, their awareness, their ability to communicate, their feelings, their memories would go on to live in some afterlife. Then you start looking. So that's the soul that most people, at least in the US, seem to believe in. This is corroborated by large national surveys that you can find by various organizations like the Pew Organization, the Gallup Organization, that have done those polls and have found that roughly between 70 and 80% of the US population in representative samples believe in some version of the soul narrative, the immortality of the soul, the afterlife, etc. So these things sort of converge, right? So we live in a country, as I'm sure you know, that is unusually religious, given how wealthy we are. The US is really an exception in terms of how religious we are, in the first world at least. And my students were no exception. So from this description of what people actually believe, you can conclude that the soul that most people believe in has three key properties, based on what they tell you. One is it's immaterial, or believed to be immaterial or non-physical. Two, it's believed to be what I call psychologically potent. So it contributes to your psychological functioning. Gives you the feelings, gives you a moral compass, gives you free will. And three, it's immortal. It carries your consciousness into the afterlife. That's what I call the traditional soul. That's the soul that most people believe in. It also happens to be the soul that is part and parcel of most religious doctrines. It's a form, if you go back in time to ideas, philosophical ideas, scientific ideas to some degree, it's a form of Cartesian or substance dualism. It's basically saying that we're made up of two things. We're made up of a physical body and an immaterial substance, an immaterial soul substance, and that the two are detachable. They interact when you're alive, but when you die, the immaterial part of the body just continues to live on and then carries your consciousness into the afterlife. So that's the soul that I was talking about.
If I may just follow up with
Sure.
one question. Modern physics has talked about parallel universes that exist.
Yes.
I haven't the slightest clue what parallel universes are, but maybe you can explain. Is there a possibility that if there are parallel universes simultaneously, that the parallel universe that we're living in is immaterial, immortal, and psychologically potent?
You asked a wonderful question. Yes.
That's the first part. The second part was, in medical science, you get a lot of people who talk about out-of-body experiences, looking back upon the body.
That's right.
And that seems to be well established. I don't know if it's a scientifically established truth.
It is, yeah.
So if you're outside your body, and this is scientifically proved, that you can look back on your doctors operating on you,
yes.
Does that not say that we have an immaterial, immortal, and potentially psychologically potent entity that is outside the body?
That's why I love the Q&A session. It's much better than me standing here talking to you, because this is the fun part. These are wonderful questions, so let me take them in turn. Let's first take the parallel universe, multiverse question. It is true indeed that theoretical physicists and cosmologists are postulating, based on their theories, the potential existence of a multiverse, so a number of other universes. This is just a theoretical speculation at this point. There's no evidence, there's no empirical evidence yet that there are such universes. But let's assume that they were. Let's assume that our universe was not the only one and that there was a multiplicity of universes. The first question we'd have to ask is, in our universe, do we have souls? And if we have souls, then maybe there's a place for them to go. And the place would be those parallel universes. So that's the first question we have to address, right? Do we have souls? If we don't have souls, then nothing is going to go on to live in those putative parallel universes. So now I'm going to segue to your second question, which is wonderful. So I don't know if you've all heard of this phenomenon, but there is indeed a well-established psychological phenomenon called out-of-body experiences. They sometimes accompany what's called near-death experiences. So, there's no doubt that the phenomenon is real in the sense that people subjectively report that they think they left their body. As you said, they report that their soul was floating about in the room, and they report that they could hear and see everything that was in the room while, for example, surgeons were operating on them or while family members were visiting. Okay, so there's no question that people report that. The question now is that interpretation true, right? Is it really true that there's a floating soul that was hovering about the room and could see everything that was happening? That's the question. It's a question of interpretation. Nobody in the sciences doubts that people are telling the truth about what they feel, right? But how do we interpret those subjective impressions? To give an analogy, for example, we could all today now say, look, I feel very strongly with every fiber of my being that the Earth is stationary. And we can share that feeling. People can say, oh, me too, me too. We can establish the fact that tons and tons of people report very sincerely feeling that the Earth is not moving. So that's what people report. Now the question is does that correspond to anything true out there? In the case of the Earth, the answer is no. We know that people's feelings about how things behave is just not related to the truth. We know that the Earth is moving around the Sun at the speed of about 67,000 miles per hour. And it so happens, for reasons that we understand, that we don't feel that way. In part because we're moving with the Earth. Right? So now, in the case of the out-of-body experiences, there is a way to decide objectively whether people can in fact see everything that happens. And here's how you do it, and it's been done. What you do is you take laptop computers, for example, that you place on top of cabinets or closets in the rooms, in hospital rooms where people are likely to have out-of-body experiences following surgery, for example, or before surgery even. And you display on these laptops particular series of numbers or shapes or colors. The prediction is very simple. If indeed your immaterial soul, when you're hovering around the room, can see everything and hear everything with your immaterial pair of eyes and ears, then you should be able to see something that your body, lying on the bed from a much more restricted vantage point, could not see. Right? Now, imagine that upon regaining consciousness, people were to say something like, okay, I tell you what happened to me. My soul was floating about, and I noticed a laptop computer on the cabinet, and here's the sequence of numbers I saw there. 734, 234, 1, 0, 55. And suppose this actually was the sequence. Then indeed we would have good evidence, under controlled conditions, that the soul can operate, or consciousness can operate outside the confines of the body. It's not sufficient to have people tell you, it feels this way to me. It's not sufficient because of the Earth example, because of all kinds of other examples. That's why scientists do controlled experiments, because nature is complicated. The reason people tell you those things is simply that they feel that way. And maybe when they say, I heard everything that happened, maybe they're basically relying on memories before they lost consciousness. So we have no way of really knowing whether that's true unless we run carefully controlled experiments of the laptop kind. And that's been done. And guess what people found? Exactly nothing. Okay? There's not a single case where someone accurately reports what is on the laptop in those kinds of circumstances. So that's what we would need. That's what you would need to convince the scientific community that indeed cognition and perception can happen outside the confines of the physical body, and therefore that there's something to the soul narrative. So, now back to your first question. If there's no reason to think, for this reason and others as well, that we have a soul, then the next question doesn't arise. Right? If we have no soul, then there's no place for us to go when we die. When we die, we know that our physical bodies eventually decompose. And unless you have some magic powers that can reassemble all these molecules and atoms in precisely the same configuration, here on Earth or in some other universe, there's no reason to think that we will live again. So that's sort of the answer to these questions. Yes?
I have.
Go upstairs. Okay,
I
good.
like what Paul said. He said make it very brief. So I have a couple of comments,
Sure.
and I'd like to know what you think about them. Seems to me that evolution doesn't apply to the issues such as God, religion, or soul. In other words, the more forward we have gone, the more backward we have gotten. Let's say the ancient Mithras, the Persian Mithras, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, they worshipped sun, moon, nature, that kind of thing. And because of polytheism, other religions and other gods was accepted to them. They won't kill each other. But it has happened more so than later on with the Abrahamic religion, that they all have been killing each other, and all for the sake of God and soul and that kind of thing. And the other thing I wanted to say is that it looks like religion or belief in soul or heaven or that kind of thing is a wrong form of psychotherapy. That let's say we want to believe that the 25-year-old that God took it away from us is because his soul still is alive and he is in heaven. What do you think?
I thank you for your thoughts and your comments. The question of whether belief in God or the soul, for example, is helpful or therapeutic to people is an empirical question in the sense that it can be measured. In fact, people have tried to measure it. So, for example, what you may have read is that here in the US at least, religious people tend to live longer, they tend to be happier, etc., etc. So people there's all kinds of studies like that. They compare groups of people who are religious in the US versus groups of people who are not religious on all kinds of measures. You know, life expectancy, subjective happiness, how long they stay married, all these kinds of measures that are supposed to indicate health. And over what they find is that being religious in the US is beneficial to one's health and well-being. Now, we might ask why. One possibility that religious apologists tout is that you see those beliefs are really useful to people. Well, if you actually look into this more carefully, it turns out that's not the right answer. The right answer has to do with social groups and bonding. It turns out that in a country like the US that is overwhelmingly religious, it helps to belong to a religion, right? Because you have more support networks, you have more groups you can go to, there's no negative bias against you if you're religious. If you come to America and you say, I'm religious, nobody's going to blink an eye. If you come and say, I'm an atheist, I mean, that's a different... So we know that the two most despised minorities in the US are Muslims and atheists. Okay? Muslims, sadly, we have an idea why. Atheists, we also sort of know why. So it's not surprising then that being a non-believer is not as healthy. It's a bit like, say, being black in America. Let's say, suppose you go back and things have gotten much better for people of of color in the U.S., fortunately, but they're still not great. But let's go back in time. Not even slavery, but say, before the civil rights movement. If you were to do studies on black people and white people, you'd notice that black people are not as happy, not as wealthy, don't live lives that are as long. And you could say, well, maybe there's something about the inherent blackness that makes you... But of course, it had nothing to do with being inherently black. It had to do with the social conditions under which those people found themselves. The minute you actually integrate them, give them basic human rights, and they're lifted out of poverty, they're not going to be any more miserable than white people. The same, I think, answer is true in the case of religion. And if you go, there's a simple test for that. You go to places in the world, countries in the world where a majority of people are non-religious, let's say in Western Europe or in Scandinavia, and you look at how good, healthy those societies are, they're some at the top. So, for example, the United Nations publishes every year a Human Development Index, right, which ranks all the nations in the world on the basis of how healthy they are. Right? First of all, the U.S. is not number one. It's not towards the bottom. It's not by far not number one. It's countries that are the least religious that tend to be at the very top, which goes to show that religious belief is not what is causing the phenomenon. It's just this notion of group belonging. So if you belong to, say, a group like this, then you're going to get as much from the interactions with your peers than you would if you belong to a church, for example. So it's not really the beliefs themselves that play a role in this case. It's really this notion, this form of belongingness that as human beings we all strive to belong to different groups and communities. Research should stop now then? Yes? Okay.